Hello and welcome to For Future Generations. I am Jeff Waugh. I am joined by my friend Sean as always. And tonight we have something a little different. We have a special guest. This is Samuel Johnson. He's an Anglican Christian from Michigan, currently living in West Virginia. He's been married to his wife Annette for 7 years, and they have four beautiful children, a fifth on the way. He is a lawyer for HSLDA, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, where he serves the areas of Michigan and Alabama, defending the rights of parents to homeschool their children. He has held elected office in his Michigan township and has also served as a law clerk to Justice Tom Parker, Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. He has recently written a book on monarchy titled Lex Regis, which is hopefully soon to be published. And in this book, he makes the biblical and political arguments for the rule of kings rather than republics or democracies. So, welcome, Samuel. We're glad to have you. And so, Sean sent over maybe before we go into that, Samuel, if you want to give us just like the 5 second blurb on your book, what is it? What is it about? It's called Lex Regis. Give us your introduction to it.
Well, yeah, thank you. First of all, thanks very much for having me on tonight. Secondly, the full title of my book is Lex Regis Recovering the Ethos of Monarchy for Christian Political Theology. And in this book, I make three strains of argument about how and why monarchy is superior to all other forms of government. I make the scriptural argument, the philosophical argument, and the historical argument. And we'll probably go into all of those in a little greater detail later on. But uh, suffice it to say, monarchy, I think, is the most scriptural, first and foremost. I think historically it's proven to be the most beneficial form of government, and philosophically it's the most logically consistent form of government, with a lot of biblical concepts such as patriarchy, which we'll probably also go into later.
All right, excellent. So, Sean, you sent me over this meme as sort of a place to start. So, before we get too far into it, let's show something. It's a little bit funny, it's a little bit serious, but here she is.
Yeah.
Here she is.
I think about this every time I think of monarchy,
So,
and the reason I find that this is so powerful is that nobody ever says it wasn't real monarchy or monarchism.
right.
They always admit, yeah, you can look at real historical examples and
hmm
you can judge me and my political philosophy based on that. And it's very straightforward. I respect that. So even if I'm not like 100% ready to go full monarchy, I just something I respect. And I think that people who are not in that camp should also respect that we can look at things in real history and say, this is what it was, this is what it could be again.
Yeah, and it's always a good sign when the people who hold to a particular position are not ashamed of it. So for those who aren't looking at the screen right now, you've got your authoritarian left. No, it wasn't real communism, and then libertarian left. No, it wasn't real anarchy, and then your libertarian right. No, it wasn't real capitalism, and then your authoritarian right. Yeah, you got your Chad meme. He's wearing a king's crown. He says, "Yes, it was real monarchy, and it was glorious." So always good when people are not ashamed of the thing that they are promoting to you. That's always a bad sign when somebody's like, well, communism is great in theory, but in practice, it's like, well, maybe if your theory is great and your practice is bad, your theory might be bad too. Just a little bit of food for thought there. But anyway, Sean, which direction were you wanting to go with this more particularly?
Um, I was hoping that Samuel would just kind of make his argument and we would help facilitate that.
Okay,
Um,
so first off, Sam, I wanted to open with one question, which I think will set sort of the the groundwork for this whole thing. So in the Declaration of Independence, there is this very key clause, right? All men are created equal with certain inalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and property, or the pursuit of happiness, as your flavor of right-wing radical may be. But all men are created equal, and that this is a summary. I think it's not lost on most people that the name of your book is Lex Regis, sort of taking a page or responding, as it were, to another book by Samuel Rutherford. You know, Lex Rex, the rules are king, or the law is king. And as a summary of his arguments, I kind of wrote down, his idea: all men are created equal, none are by nature rulers over others. Rulership is ultimately artificial insofar as it is to the good of those ruled. So, what is your position on the statement, all men are created equal?
In short, it is neither self evident nor a truth.
Okay. So,
Anybody who looks around the world honestly can easily see that all men are not equal. There is a certain artificial equality that is imposed by Scripture, but that equality is strictly juridical in Scripture.
mhm,
And what I mean by that is it is an equality before the law for purposes of judgment, which means that men of all stations, all conditions, and all places in the hierarchical order of the universe are subject to the same laws and to the same penalties for breaking the laws. A an earl does not get off scot-free for murder, while a peasant would get punished for the same crime.
mhm,
So that's juridical equality. None of the Bible mandates any kind of equality other than juridical equality. So throughout Scripture, we see that hierarchy in all things is the order of the day, and that it is equality that is artificial. Equality is an artificial rule imposed on the natural order of hierarchy by divine command. And what we've done, especially in the Declaration of Independence and other documents that have been based on it or contributed to it philosophically, is we've flipped that concept backwards. We've flipped it around. So now, in modern political philosophy, we believe that equality is the natural order and inequality is artificial and positive, as Rutherford said. Rutherford was one of the first exponents of this idea. He was basically an Enlightenment philosopher before it was cool, which is really tragic considering that in other ways he was an eminently orthodox and wonderful theologian. I think he had some blind spots in his political thinking, which I'll probably go into later. Maybe we'll see. But I think some of the blind spots in his thinking were where he borrowed too much from the humanist Renaissance and the theologians of the Catholic Church.
Hey, I wanted to step in real quick. So you were saying that in the Declaration of Independence that it's talking about this equality of all people
Mhm.
and all men are created equal. And you're saying that, well, that's not true except in the kind of judicial way. I don't remember the exact term that you used, but wouldn't that
Juridical.
juridical?
Mhm.
Wouldn't that be the argument of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created? He said all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, life,
Mhm.
liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Mhm.
So wouldn't isn't that already the argument of the Declaration of Independence, that it's equality in a very specific way?
That second section, they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. I can agree with that up to a point. Scripturally, no right is unalienable. Even the
Uh,
right to life can be alienated by one's own actions.
well, and
oh,
that
If I
is
commit
certainly the
murder,
way the
yeah, I
government,
see. I see
even
what
at
you
the
mean.
time, was constructed. Your right to
mhm,
life, liberty, and property were all subject to your behavior within your culture. So
precisely.
Okay,
even though they sort of said such,
interesting.
I believe it's maybe with the proviso that,
Mhm,
without due reason, without
right.
interference, without the ruling of a court of law, these rights are inalienable.
But again, this is why the Declaration of Independence was considered so radical in its time.
Hmm.
It was seen as a radical revolutionary document precisely because the old understanding of rights and responsibilities was that rights flowed from responsibilities, and the
Mm.
two could not be divorced, and responsibilities took precedence over rights. So by focusing on the rights and by focusing on equality, Thomas Jefferson took the classical understanding of politics and of anthropology and flipped it backwards.
Hmm.
And that flipping, even though Thomas Jefferson was not an anti hierarchicalist entirely, and even though he accepted certain things like the death penalty, uh, his formulation of political theory in the Declaration of Independence and his other writings um, has influenced subsequent generations of political philosophers in ways that led to greater consistency with his words instead of his actions. And that's because ideas have consequences, right?
Right.
So that's the problem here. Thomas Jefferson said all men are created equal. He owned slaves. That's
Hmm.
not equality there,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Did he really believe in the radical equality he espoused, even in a lot of his letters against slavery?
Well, and that goes to the question I had about the death penalty. Because if he's saying that you have an inalienable right to life, but clearly, I mean, the Constitution of the United States had the death penalty
Mhm.
right away. Maybe not at the constitutional level. You would know more than I would if it was a state level thing, however that works. But
It was a
uh,
state level.
yeah,
Yeah,
Well,
um,
there was no federal government for the first little bit. Yeah.
yeah. But
yeah,
the
federal
point,
crime barely existed. It was basically treason, and that's about it.
right?
Hmm.
So, would you say that they were just inconsistent with that? That they're saying there's this inalienable right to life, but they also have the death penalty?
Well, to some extent, nobody can ever be totally consistent with egalitarianism. It is
Yeah,
an ideology that cannot work, period.
yeah,
Hmm.
So, anybody that is an egalitarian and also believes in a functional society is logically inconsistent to some degree. So, yeah, I would say Thomas Jefferson and others like him were, um, to a large extent, inconsistent with their own beliefs. And those beliefs were consistentized, if that's a word, to a greater and greater extent as political philosophy evolved from Rousseau, or from Locke to Rousseau, and by various other permutations to Marx, which was really where the logical consistency of egalitarianism ends up. To be a consistent egalitarian, to the extent to which that's possible, is to be a communist.
yeah. I had put in the chat. I had another thing about John Locke. So I want to know your opinion of the argument that the divine right of kings comes from uh, the it comes from Adam being the firstborn, and then his firstborn would be the
Mhm.
ruler over the next, and then that kind of argument. The reason that I uh, bring that up is that everyone knows John Locke's second treatise on civil government, but his first treatise is arguing against
Mhm.
that divine right of kings. Where do you stand on that, in particular particularly the idea that it was Adam and then his firstborn and then that firstborn and so on and so forth would be the king.
Well, I think that argument is derived directly from Scripture, where you see in Genesis 10, the table of nations, God dividing up the nations according to their families. And of course, this gets down to what a nation actually is. If a nation is, in fact, a family, an extended family, then the patriarchal argument is the argument for monarchy in that family. So and we see God dividing up the world by their families in Genesis 10. And of course, each one of these families is named after their head.
Yeah.
So I think the whole concept of covenantal headship ties into this. And I spend at least 2 chapters in my book dealing with the concept of covenantal headship and kingship. Covenantal headship is patriarchy as applied to this. Covenantal monarchy is patriarchy applied to the state. So I agree with Filmer and others in their argument that monarchical power is patriarchal, and it descends from Adam via generation, or the right of conquest, which is another area that's very broad. It's a very big discussion, but to some extent,
Does that need to be
it
another episode, the right of conquest?
the
Because
right of
you
it could
immediately have
be.
my attention. Yes.
Well, if
Yes.
you've
If
read
that,
Locke, you know he has nothing nice to say about right of conquest, and that was something I was going to ask you some about, because the right of conquest does not just boil itself down to might makes right, but
No.
I think we'll uh, I think we'll move on to that a little bit later because um, you know one of the things that you were talking about is the biblical support for the older rules over the younger is not just in Genesis 10 with the table of
Mhm.
nations. It actually starts in Genesis, I believe it's 4, with the story of Cain and Abel, where
Mhm.
Cain's offering was not accepted, and in God's placation of Cain, he says to him, uh, well, I should have probably pulled up the exact verbiage, but anyway, essentially he says, look, if you do right, will you not rule over him? Seemingly indicating that he was the older brother. If
Mhm.
that's not what was intended, honestly, I don't know what he would have been saying in that context.
Yeah. I think that's a good argument. Ultimately, there's patterns and precedents all over Scripture regarding monarchy, hereditary succession, primogeniture. I go through a lot of those in my book.
Hmm.
But to go back to the scriptural argument on monarchy for a second, there are two forms of government that God ever directly instituted by special revelation, and those are ad hoc dictatorship and hereditary monarchy. That's a
Hmm.
bold claim. I justify it at length in my book.
Okay.
But the judges would be ad hoc dictatorship and then hereditary
Hmm.
monarchy. Those are the only two forms of civil government God ever directly instituted.
Okay.
That at least should give us some kind of food for thought as we're discussing what government is and should be.
Well, and that's another thing that. So my father-in-law is quite a bookish individual, and one thing that he likes to point out is that not all dictatorships are necessarily repressive. And one of his favorite books, and one that I appreciate quite a bit, is Heinlein's Starship Troopers, which is a dictatorship per se. In and of itself, it is a
Mhm.
dictatorship, and yet it's this very libertarian kind of ecosystem where there's as long as you're following the law and doing what you're supposed to, you're kind of left alone. There's not a whole lot of rules. But ad hoc dictatorship, a modern person hears ad hoc dictatorship, and essentially what they hear is, wow, a bunch of violent people who are just ruling over people with an iron fist. If
Mhm.
you would, could you kind of define that just a little bit for people who might not know what you mean by that?
Well, I think dictatorship gets a bad name because of the practice of technocratic dictatorship, especially in the 20th century. People think a lot more about people like Hitler and Mussolini and all the bad guys in World War II, more than they think of people like, well, I don't like him, but Oliver Cromwell. He
Hmm.
was a dictator, and he was more tyrannical than most English kings. I'll put it that way. But that means he wasn't very tyrannical. Most kings historically have allowed for uh, heights of liberty that would knock our socks off today.
Hmm.
We are among the most regulated societies in history. Our freedom pretty much consists in the ability to fill in a couple of bubbles on a piece of paper every 2 years, and that's about it.
could you give some examples of the types of freedoms that kings have given historically that would just blow us away? Because I'm very interested in that.
Well, when you wanted to fish in the river, you could go fishing
Yeah,
without
and
going to buy a license first. And then you could sell the fish to your neighbor if you wanted for profit.
hmm And
I
Sean, you're writing a book about Robin Hood right now. The whole
yeah.
idea of the people revolting because you were shooting the king's deer, and here we live in a country that is supposedly the freest and fairest that has ever lived. And if you shoot the state's deer without permission first,
Yep.
you're going to be in a whole lot of trouble.
Well, so my
Right.
pushback, because anything I'm pushing back on, it's because I know that people listening to this are going to have
Hmm.
the same
Of
pushbacks.
course.
So when we're talking about fishing, when there's only like a couple million people in the whole world, like yeah, you can fish to your heart's content. But now that
Hmm.
we're at the close to 8 billion mark, I think I know we're over
Hmm.
Hmm.
7. Um, the argument would be that it's actually a matter of being at this point in history that we have to have like deer licenses or fishing license or whatever.
Okay, then let's look at agriculture. The first governmental agriculture regulations, I believe, came out in the 19th century. Which country do you think they came out in?
France.
The United States.
Oh, okay.
The
First,
uh, the monarchs of most of history have regulated agriculture next to none at all.
Hmm.
The agriculture, food production, and really the production and manufacturing of most kinds of goods have been regulated by the trades and industries and farmers themselves. For most of history, for most of medieval history in England and France, the guilds controlled industry.
Right.
They were the ones
Hmm.
who regulated things. And so it was a lot of self regulation by industry, which of course brings up things about conflict of interest and all that. But the government wasn't really regulating things. It was the people themselves who actually were regulating their own means of livelihood.
I think that at that point it would come down to what the individual person thinks is best for the regulation of food, because monarchy
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily mean hey we
No
should not
regulation of food at
regulate.
all.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Uh,
People don't understand the tremendous discretion that a king has to regulate or not regulate, deregulate. There's a big difference between having power and using it.
yeah,
Hmm.
A lot of people don't understand that distinction. People think if you give somebody a power, they will use it. That's not the case.
yeah.
There are a lot of checks on the power of even the most theoretically absolute king.
Hmm.
Like I said, the king's one man. If you antagonize too many people at once, you lose your hat and your head with it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, we were talking about earlier just the concept of, where does kingship come from? Does it come from, when God created Adam, when God created Cain and Abel? And I want to get your take on sort of where does government come from? So there's this big debate in, as it were, the libertarian world, where among Christians we ask if there had never been a fall, would there be necessarily a government or a government body? Would there be higher and lower people? Would there, it's one thing to say there might be arbiters, a
Mhm.
third party who's uninvolved. Brothers do that all the time. It's like, hey, I think this, you think that. Let's find someone who's uninvolved but has a fair mind to hear us. But would there actually be a distinction between higher and lower classes or higher and lower people um, in a pre-fall world?
Mhm. I believe there would be. And it would come out of this role of the arbiter that you're talking about. But to go to the heart of the matter, as I see it, honor thy father and mother is part of the moral law that predates the fall.
Hmm.
The fall did not create the moral law. The fall was a breach of the moral law. And the
Hmm.
moral law existed from eternity past because the moral law is a reflection of God's character. So, honor thy father and thy mother is a part of that moral law that would have existed had there been no fall. We would all have honored our fathers and our mothers perfectly, but that still would have been the order of the day. And Adam, as our ultimate father, would have received a higher share of honor because he would have the honor of all. Whereas, say, my father would have the honor of myself and his children, but not the honor of everybody. So, yes, there would be a hierarchy,
Okay.
even pre-fall. And you know, I'm going to go out on a limb here and do a Thomism. Um, Thomas Aquinas agreed with this. Again, I don't have the direct quote in front of me, but um, Thomas agreed that government was a free pre-fall institution that was made larger in scope of duty by the necessity that the fall created.
Okay. Yeah, and that sort of answers the question that I was going to kind of follow up with. Was you're talking about, Adam would have had the most honor of all of the fathers because he's the progenitor of all men, right? And I honor my father. I like to
Hmm.
believe that I honor my father, but if my father called me on the phone and he said, "Hey, today you need to wear a pink thong," um, I'm not going to do it,
Right.
right? Whereas if the king tells you, "Hey, today everybody in the country is going to wear a pink thong," you have to do it because he's the king, right? So there does seem to me to be a bit of distinction there between, you know, the honor that is due my father and the obedience that is due a king. Um, yes, I honor my father, but that doesn't mean that I obey his every whim. Maybe when I was a child I did, but now that I'm a man, I've put away that childish obedience.
Hmm.
Hopefully, I'm not rebellious to the wisdom of my father, but it doesn't mean that I'm necessarily, as it were, subject to him in all things. What's your
Hmm.
take on that?
Well, it's the difference between jurisdictional levels. There are several different jurisdictions of authority, each of which overlaps with the others, and each of which has its own distinct boundaries. So, you, as the head of your own household, are no longer a member of your father's household and therefore are not directly under his household jurisdiction. But as the father is the king of his household, so the king is the father of the household of households.
Hmm.
So the king's authority is analogous to that of a father in his household, except everybody's a member of his household.
Mm. So the
It,
king's authority over precedes even the father's authority in that aspect.
Not necessarily, no. The
Okay.
king, in my conception and in the traditional Christian conception, heads of households were the king's primary subjects. Everybody was a
Hmm.
subject of the king, but it was understood that the heads of household had a jurisdiction that the king was not to penetrate. So things like
Right.
the education and care and feeding of children, those were primarily the responsibility of the head of household. And he was answerable to the king for how well he did those things.
Yeah.
But the king could not pierce the veil of household authority and start ruling, making rules for the education of children and mandating that they study for 5 hours a day or whatever.
Right.
So there are jurisdictional limits, but the king's authority is analogous to that of a father in his household.
So this absolute monarchy then is not completely absolute in that sense.
No, no. Even the most absolute monarchists in history have always maintained that the king is subject to the divine law, to reason, and to biblical limits on the bounds of his jurisdiction.
Hmm. All right.
it's interesting that this whole part of the conversation started with the question of the origin of government, and usually we would say, well, the origin of government. I say we, like
Mhm.
the
The royal
royal
we.
we,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, the
The democratic we,
yeah,
mind
what
you.
what you would usually hear from, I guess, American theologians would be something like, well, because of the fall, we had to keep sin back. We had to do something that punished sin, and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But what it seems like you're saying is there's a positive law aspect of, we have to have a ruler because our, the God's eternal law, his moral law says we have to have a ruler.
Mhm.
So that it's a very different kind of way of looking at it that I had never heard before. So it's just something that kind of struck me in that.
Right. And not only Thomas Aquinas, but also Calvin, Luther, several of the reformers tied civil government directly back to the fifth commandment. Um, they believed that honor thy father and mother meant not only biological fathers and mothers, but all those who are placed in any authority above us in any hierarchy of church and state. And I believe the Westminster Confession says this as well. Um, but yeah, the fifth commandment is the origin of government, in my view, and it is so in its principle, not just in its iteration in the book of Exodus. And its principle, as we know, is eternal.
Hmm.
I wanted to go back to something that I put in the chat. I had asked the question. I didn't know the best way to word it, but can non-reformed people read this book and get something out of it? The reason I asked that is you had mentioned covenant theology as a big part of the book,
Mm-hmm.
and guys like me, so I'm Lutheran, so
Mm-hmm.
not Reformed. Um, One of the things that kind of rubbed me not necessarily like the wrong way as a whole, but like there were parts of Stephen Wolf's The Case for Christian Nationalism that were distinctly like, well, hey, if you're not reformed, then I've got nothing for you. Like I don't really care about you. You know what I mean? Like it
Yeah.
came off that way to those outside the camp.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so outside of specific things where you will argue from um, a specifically reformed covenant theology, um, would there
The
be any?
specifically reformed version of covenant theology doesn't really figure in what I'm talking about. Most of it
Okay.
is exploring examples and principles of the office of a covenantal head. What
Okay.
is a head? What does it mean to be a head? What are the covenants of headship? Where do we see these principles illustrated in Scripture? So, to that extent, covenant theology is part of it. But as I said, the theological portion of my book is only one part of it. I also make arguments from history, arguments from political philosophy. There are there's something in it for just about everybody. So even if you disagree with my theological arguments, you can also glean a lot of my ideas from the historical and philosophical portions.
Okay.
Hmm.
Another
All right.
question
Well,
that I had, kind
just
of
real
along.
quick before you ask this question, just a technical question about the book per se as a book. Is this thing going to be a tome? Is it going to be a light read? About how many pages are we talking here?
I've got about 387 pages,
Okay, so
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 it's
about 400
pretty
pages.
man-
Yeah.
pretty manageable.
So
Yeah.
yeah, you could read it in a day, day and a half if you're
Mhm.
wanting to get through it. All right, Sean, you were saying.
Um, the passage, I don't know the exact address of it, but like the passage that people will always fight politics over is where the people of Israel ask Samuel for a king,
First
right?
Samuel 8. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Hmm.
One of the
So,
most misinterpreted passages of scripture in history.
well,
Um,
would you like to just give kind of a flyover view of
yeah.
where you stand with that?
You don't have to
Well,
exegete the whole thing, but
Not the whole
kind of
thing,
give
yeah.
us
Give
give
us
us your take.
give us the
yeah,
elevator speech of
I agree with Calvin that the institution of the monarchy was prophesied and foretold as a blessing by God in Genesis chapter 49, where Jacob blesses Judah by saying, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and unto him will the gathering of the people be." So, monarchy was foretold and prophesied as a blessing from God.
Mhm.
So what I think First Samuel 8 is not a condemnation of monarchy. There's two arguments that I like to use here. The first is that First Samuel 8, insofar as it is a condemnation of the people's request for a king per se, it is to be understood now not as a condemnation of civil monarchy, but of ecclesiastical papacy. Because what the people were asking for was a king like all the other nations. And if you look at the history of the ancient Near East, the kings of all the other nations were both civil and ecclesiastical rulers.
Hmm.
And God had that position by covenant with Israel concluded on Mount Sinai. God was their king. Okay. So, of course, this is where covenant theology kind of comes into it. So, if you disagree with covenant theology, this isn't going to be persuasive to you. But the covenant that God concluded with Israel, according to the Reformed persuasion, still exists, and it has an heir. That heir is the church, not any civil state. So, to the extent that 1 Samuel 8 is an argument against monarchy, it is an argument today against a monarchy of the entire church, the entire heir to the covenant by which God was king of Israel. So, that would be an argument more against papacy than against monarchy. The second argument I use is that we see throughout the scriptures God's repeated pattern of giving the rebellious people of Israel a bellyful of what they asked for, making them just plain sick
Mhm.
of it. You know, you see the quail, you see the manna in the wilderness, you see God doing this all the time. They ask for something they shouldn't have, and He's like, "Yep, well, here you go."
Mhm.
And pretty soon they get so sick of it, they ask Him to take it away. You know, so I think what happened is you can kind of tell by reading through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy that after 400 years of slavery in Egypt, the people were pretty drunk on freedom. And you don't take a band of newly emancipated slaves to a functioning civil monarchy in a day. So, through the period of the judges, God gave them a bellyful of their freedom.
Hmm.
And their freedom led them to apostatize. The apostasy led them to oppression. The oppression led them to cry to God for a deliverer, which He would grant them, and they'd rinse and repeat. So, after 400 years of this, Israel had enough. And the problem was, God wasn't ready to bring His king along yet. David, whom God had all along intended to appoint as king of Israel, prophesied back in Genesis, wasn't ready yet. And they
Mhm.
asked for a king. So he warned them, if you get a king, this is what he's going to do. But rather than listening to the words of God and saying, okay, we'll hold off, they insisted on a king. So he gave them a belly full of what they asked for in the person of King Saul.
Mhm.
So when Saul had exhausted the nation by his rebellion, as we all know, they were finally ready to submit to God's king when he was ready to bring them along.
Yeah. See the ex the explanation of that passage that I had always heard in church growing up was a competition between two camps. One which was always, anti-monarchy, kings bad. They had a libertarian social order, and that's what they should have stuck with. And as much as I liked libertarian social order, that just didn't seem to be the writing of the passage. The what was being explained. I think the best explanation is, at the end of that passage, God says, they have not rejected you, Samuel, but they have rejected me from being king over them.
Mhm.
And if you take it at face value, essentially God is saying, you were a monarchy with me as your king. They demand a monarchy with a man as their king. He's not saying that monarchy is per se bad. He's saying that you have to have the right king of your
Mhm.
monarchy.
And that monarchy, like all the other nations, is bad.
Well,
Right.
so that would be the other argument that I've always
Mhm.
kind of held to with that passage is that they're not saying give us a king that has the attributes of the kings of the other nations. It's saying make us like the other nations in giving us a king. So I
Hmm.
that is the part that has always tripped me up with that because like when I was in my most libertarian phase, like whatever crazy amount of years that was, that would always be my go-to is you're looking at this and these people say, "Hey, give us a king." I mean, even in the Exodus passages, just off the top of my head,
Mhm.
he's saying like, one day you guys are going to ask for a king, and when you do, like, this is the kind of king you should ask for. So they're not asking for like, hey, give us a pagan king.
Mhm.
They're just saying, "Give us a king." Period. And like Jeff had pointed out, like what they're rejecting is having God as their king and asking for a king. And so I understand what you mean by the papacy argument, but it also seems
Mhm.
like the situation that they had as far as a government um, seemed to be the intent that uh, like God's intent for them. So
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
to that I would counter with the Genesis 49 argument. If God always intended to keep them with the same theocratic government that we see during the time of the judges, why did he foretell the monarchy from Judah as a blessing in Genesis 49?
So again, this is just me pushing back. Like it's not personal or nothing, but
Mhm.
God tells them uh, in those same passages, or at least around them, like when you fall away, then you're going to call to me, and I'm going to bring you back, and that kind of thing. So
Mhm.
at that point, we say, well, it's God's intent for them to fall away, and that's what God always wanted for them, was for them to start giving their kids to Molech, and then they can call back to me.
Well, those passages were not in the context of Jacob blessing his sons. That was not specifically a blessing, that was a foretelling, but it wasn't a
Okay.
blessing. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, was not just a foretelling, it was an unequivocal blessing.
So if we take that, we would say that the scepter that shall never depart is currently in the hands of Christ,
Correct.
right?
Yes.
So now that
And it
we
is
have God as our king again, why do we need a human king? Would be the argument.
okay. Well, God uses means to govern his world. And we see in Romans 13 that he appoints civil governors for the purpose of working his will among his people. See, God has always been king. There has never yet been a second or a nanosecond of time where God has not been king of everyone, everywhere, no matter what. God is king. So the fact that Jesus Christ has taken over the kingship of his father David doesn't mean that God no longer uses means in the human world to govern his people. So God still uses rulers. And the way I usually talk about it is, and this goes back to the form of covenantal headship that I talk about at length in my book. You have multiple layers of headship in every sphere. So in the civil sphere, you have kings over princes over the people. In the household, you have the husband over the wife over the children. In the church, I would argue you have bishops over the pastors and elders over the people. So you have this multi tiered hierarchy in every sphere that we see instituted by God directly in Scripture multiple times. So, in keeping with that general structure, every king of a nation is a lesser magistrate in the kingdom of Christ. As
Okay.
all nations become Christian, every king of a Christian nation is a lesser magistrate in the kingdom of Christ. Same goes for every bishop, same goes for every nobleman, same goes for every elder, same goes for every justice of the peace.
All right.
So
So
Everybody.
the argument there then would be not that there has to be government and therefore monarchy should be it because it's the best, but there has to be hierarchy and
Mhm.
therefore monarchy.
Right, because monarchy is the only form of government that is inherently hierarchical.
Right. Well,
hmm.
Jeff, you had
All right.
some.
So you've talked several times, referenced the passage where monarchy is prophesied until the coming of Shiloh. And there is this argument made in Lex Rex, um, where, and I'll actually just quote him directly. He says, "I conceive it to be evident that royal." Oh wait, no, this is the the wrong quote. I want to throw that one at you later. But let's see, where are my notes? All right, so I forget where I wrote it down. But anyway, I'll just go off the top of my head. Essentially, he makes the argument in the book Lex Rex that monarchy was a promised institution to bring about the coming of the Messiah, much like the temple and the tabernacle and the sacrificial law, and that with the coming of Christ, with his sacrifice on the cross, death, burial, resurrection unto eternal life, everlasting, etc., that monarchy was done away with the destruction of Israel. When the Jews were no more, that monarchy is no more. Um, First off, that's a theological statement, but it's also a bit of a practical statement as well. So, what would be your retort to Rutherford in this conjecture of his?
I disagree with dispensationalism.
So, Rutherford was a dispensationalist. You heard it here first.
Proto-dispensationalist.
All
I
right.
said he was an Enlightenment philosopher before it was cool. I
All
mean,
right. Yeah.
So
Well,
why? So can I ask, why do you think that he has been so popular? Like, so many of
Mhm.
our guys are just gushing over this book, and you
Because
saw
he's a
Doug.
giant of the Reformed Presbyterian faith.
Okay.
He was really a tremendous theologian. I
mm,
have benefited greatly from studying several of his theological works. They're very, very good.
interesting.
Much of his theology, strictly speaking, was ruthlessly orthodox, um, very thorough, very well argued. I mean, I don't agree with 100% of it, but it was really, really good on the whole. Where
Hmm,
he got things wrong, I think, was in political theory, and especially in certain philosophical presuppositions that he adopted without questioning them. And I'm not like a Van Tillian presuppositionalist by any stretch. I've already done more than one Thomism in this episode, and I intend to continue doing them. But he accepted certain philosophical suppositions that were not derived from Scripture, and indeed were against a lot of what Scripture stands for. And he adopted several of these from the authors surrounding the Italian Renaissance, including Bellarmino, Suarez, several others that he quotes very liberally. And these suppositions were primarily in the area of anthropology. Um, insofar, in his anthropology, Rutherford was a consistent nominalist. Okay. Now, nominalism and realism, I don't know to what extent you or your listeners are familiar with the debate there, but realism was the dominant philosophy for much of the Christian Middle Ages and the Reformation. And this is the theory that says absolutes, abstracts, and um, categories have real existence. So the church, for example, is a real organism. The nation is a real organism. The household is a real organism. And these things have real existence quite apart from and independent of the individual human beings of which they are composed. Nominalism, on the other hand, holds that only the particular and individual has any real existence, and all categories, abstracts, and absolutes are names to which we give, or which we give to uh, more or less arbitrary assemblages of individuals.
Yeah. So it's kind of the difference between believing that there is a real thing, such as the chairness of the chair, versus calling a thing a chair because you sit upon it.
Precisely. Yeah.
Defining things by their function, or realizing that there is ultimately something underneath it that makes it what it is.
And as applied to collective entities like state, church, or household,
Hmm.
nominalism presupposes that only the individuals of which those entities are composed have real existence. So the church, for a nominalist, is merely a collection of Christian individuals.
Who then call
Whereas,
themselves a church, or who are called a
right,
church.
right, we call that the church, but there is no actually independently existing organism that is the church. The churchness of the church is confined to the Christianness of the individuals of which it is composed.
Hmm. Hmm.
Whereas the realist philosophy that motivated most of the Middle Ages, the Christian faith up until the Renaissance, was that the church is an objectively real, living, breathing organism. And each of the individuals of which it is composed is analogous to a corpuscle in that organism. And this mirrors what Paul himself said about the church. We are all members of one body. He uses the organism of the physical body as an analogy for the real church. This is philosophical realism, plain and simple. And this scriptural principle motivated pretty much all of Christendom up until the Italian Renaissance and its unfortunate absorption to some extent into Protestantism. Now, the Catholic Church had huge problems with this. It was rife within the Catholic Church. And one of the reasons these arguments became popular in the Catholic Church was because they provided Rome with a good philosophical basis for keeping the kings and civil princes of Europe subject to the Pope, which makes it all the more ironic that Rutherford would be using them.
Hmm. Interesting.
Because if you read the beginning of his book, he starts the beginning of his book arguing not against monarchy, but against episcopacy.
Hmm.
Rutherford was a Presbyterian first and an anti-monarchist second. So he needed to. Oh, I'm getting digital. All right.
Yeah, it's kind of recovered a little bit. You broke up for a second there, but you came back hard and strong.
Okay.
So you seem like you're doing okay.
Okay. Good.
Okay.
But
So
Rutherford wanted to get rid of the bishops, and it turns out to get rid of the bishops, you got to cut the king down to size too.
hmm, hmm. And as an Anglican, you're rather fond of bishopry, bishoprics as opposed to
Hmm.
presbyteries.
Right.
A a group of people who are, as it were, a collective body. You're more in line with monarchy, Anglicanism, one
Hmm.
head, and then going down to one man who's responsible for a direct assembly.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Right.
Just
Government by
out of
committee not only doesn't work, it has no precedent in Scripture.
Yeah, this is maybe slightly tangential, but I'm just curious. What is your view of a plurality of elders?
I don't see any scriptural warnings against it, provided that they are all that there is one man in the congregation that has the ultimate decision-making
Hmm.
authority.
So in Presbyterian denominations where they have, as it were,
Hmm.
a ruling elder who's over a teaching elder,
Hmm.
you'd still see that as perfectly legitimate.
Right, as long as there was
Yeah.
somebody in the congregation that had the right of last word, basically.
Hmm. Okay.
So
Yeah.
it's necessary. And it's also inevitable. I mean, most Presbyterians will tell you that there is usually one man in a session, one man in a presbytery that ultimately starts making most of the decisions. Everybody pretty
Or
much listens to him.
or one woman, in a lot of churches who makes a lot of
Uh,
decisions and then bends the men to her will. Yeah.
mhm.
On that note, what would you can you explain for outsiders like myself the relationship of the King of England with the Anglican Church and where he is in that hierarchy?
The King of England has a place in the hierarchy only in the Church of England. The Anglican communion around the world is not associated with, like,
Okay.
the Anglican church I attend is not under the authority of the Church of England.
Okay. Now
Most
in
Anglican
history,
churches are organized by autonomous province,
yeah.
which can have like a presiding bishop or like the ACNA, an archbishop over the Congress of Bishops. He doesn't have like papal authority in the Congress of Bishops or the House of Bishops. He has more the type of authority that you'd see in an Eastern Orthodox patriarch, like the primus inter pares. first among equals.
Mhm.
So he doesn't necessarily have command authority. He would be more analogous to like the and this is not a good analogy. Like it's not Foursquare by any stretch, but it's more like an ex officio moderator of a Presbyterian assembly.
Right, sort of like the very beginning church councils, which were called by
Hmm.
Constantine. He was not, by his own choice and decision. He was not ruling in those councils. He was sort of moderating those councils
Hmm.
and allowing the bishops to, as it were, make their own arguments and come to their own conclusions. Interesting, very interesting, and when
In,
put in that context, actually has a pretty decent pedigree.
mhm.
But that is not the role that
Incidentally, I
the
think
king holds today in the Church of England
the
or the
Church of
Queen
England still has the king at the
sometimes.
top of the hierarchy.
Right.
And that's one thing I think the English Reformation got wrong.
Hmm. Hmm.
Would you like to say why the English Reformation got that wrong, or what?
Well, in scripture, you have a very clear division made between the roles of a civil king and the roles of a priest.
Okay.
King Uzziah was punished with leprosy for burning incense in the temple. And you see throughout many other places where the ecclesiastical establishment was meant to be something of a counterpoint, something of a council, like a an extra monarchical entity that could either defend the people from the king or vice versa, and serve as kind of a tension to the otherwise absolute authority of the monarch.
So checks
And
and balances.
right, right.
Yeah.
But it's a recognition that the two kingdoms are distinct.
Hmm.
They, Jesus Christ is king over both, but the kingdoms of church and state are not one kingdom.
Hmm. So
So I think the
classic
church
two
should have
kingdoms.
its hierarchy, the state should have its hierarchy, and there's going to be a lot of times when the king and the archbishop or national patriarch or what have you are duking it out between themselves, but that's good because that means that they don't have a whole lot of time left to tyrannize over those below them.
Oh, for the days. Yeah. So there's one thing that you mentioned a few times, talking about households and kings being an example of fathers over households, and those households being ruled by the greater household of the nation. And you used the phrase lesser magistrates, and obviously there's been a book published about the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. It's quite popular in reform circles. I've read the book. I highly recommend the book. I think it's a fantastic book. But um, I'm kind of curious as to your view here of kingship. So let's take for granted that there is a king. Let's just
Mhm.
assume England has a king. About the time let's say before Cromwell. But then you have these lesser magistrates who are the servants of the king. Is there a time where these men are responsible to their, noblesse oblige, they are responsible to the people underneath them, that will interfere with their responsibility to their king, to the up to and including even relieving the king of his own head? Um, is that ever in your view warranted, or is that always wrong? So the Republicans at the time of Cromwell were making, or not the Republicans, I'm sorry, the monarchists at the time of Cromwell, at least when read through the eyes of Rutherford, were making the argument that, if there were a tyrannical king, if he were doing all of these evil things, then it would be necessary and godly. The right and proper thing for these people to do would be to suffer, suffer, bear, be patient, endure until God sends them some sort of ex facto deliverance. What is your take on that whole debate right there?
So I'm going to start by saying that I'm going to make two arguments here. Okay.
Hmm.
The first argument is that the monarchists in that time had a point.
Okay.
God in scripture directly says in many, many different places that we are to submit to the authority of those that are placed over us, whether it be to the king as supreme or to magistrates or to fathers, for example. We are to submit to them. So the first thing that we have to think about when we are looking at our role in relation to governing authorities, the presumption should be that we submit. Now, as in law, that doesn't mean that the presumption is non-rebuttable. All
Hmm.
right. So the lesser magistrates, and in England before Cromwell's time, these would have been primarily lesser nobles, dukes, earls, barons, etc. Each of those men had their title as magistrates, independent from the reigning king. Most of them had inherited it from their fathers. Each of them had a title to rule that was derived from kingly office, but was independent of any direct intervention by the currently reigning king. Each of them thus had an independent duty to God and to their people to fulfill the functions of a magistrate, to punish evil, and to praise the good. Now, obviously, they also had the obligation to submit. And to a large extent, if we believe that God judges people or punishes a nation by giving them wicked rulers, who are we to think we should get ourselves out of God's judgment and punishment, short circuit God's justice by deposing a wicked king that God has imposed on us as a punishment for something? So there is that argument, right? You don't want to get presumptuous enough to try to short circuit God's own justice by overthrowing every king that might be wicked.
Hmm.
On the other hand, there always comes a time when we must obey God rather than men. So when a king orders a person to do something that is sinful, that is against the law of God, it is his duty to disobey. And to some extent, a private citizen must suffer the consequences, unless this king's wickedness is so systemic that his nobles take up their duty, their independent duty, to see that justice is done in their domains and restrain the king. I think the events surrounding Magna Carta are an excellent example of this. The the magistrates, the barons, the nobles got together and did not decapitate their king. They did not overthrow the king. They restrained him. They got their power together and said, okay, look, you're not going to get away with this wickedness. You can do what you want to within the just scope of your legitimate powers. And I think that was a good thing.
We've got some comments by one of our listeners, the
Yeah.
Jaded Geek.
Do we want to hit this at the end of the show like we said we were going to, or do we want to throw those in right now?
If I might address his last comment, perhaps we are the means to end the period of judgment by overthrowing that wicked king. The Bible does not give those who are ruled and who do not have governing or magisterial power in themselves any license to overthrow those above them. So a common subject has no license to overthrow a king.
Whoop.
What I would say is that if and when it's time to overthrow a king, the people need to follow their legitimate magistrates that God has set up, because those magistrates wield the sword not in vain. And in wielding the sword, they are exercising a function for which God himself has set them apart. So as long as there is magisterial leadership, it could be that that is the de facto deliverance that you, Joffrey, had mentioned. God might bring deliverance to the people from the wicked ruler with which he was judging them in the form of a Simon de Montfort, for example, one of the great earls of England that ended the anarchy period of King Stephen's rule. So it could be that God might raise up a powerful noble who may overthrow the king and reign in his stead. Who knows?
as it were, not as a king, but maybe as a lord protector, so to speak.
or even as a king, right of
Okay.
conquest.
Yeah, yeah, and that's actually the direction that I wanted to roll this into. Um, in Lex Rex, he makes this very grand statement that conquest is wrong. If you've got you know using force and using violence against people is per se wrong. Therefore, the right of conquest, is never legitimate. Um, so there's this one quote that I wanted to throw at you from him. Um, I conceive it is to be evident that royal dignity is not immediately and without the intervention of the people's consent given by God to any one man, and that conquest and violence is no just title to a crown. So we haven't really. I mean, we've addressed it briefly um, on the first half. This royal dignity without intervention of the people's consent given by God to one man by birth. That we've we've addressed it lightly but not thoroughly. But more, I want to talk about this conquest and violence is no just title to a crown. Essentially, the argument he's making is might does not make right, but he doesn't go into great detail against that position that there is a right of conquest. He just kind of says, conquest bad, violence bad, therefore there's no right of conquest. Obviously, as Christians, we don't believe that we can just run over to Canada. I mean, as much as we'd like to, steamroll Canada, turn it into the 51st state, and just be like, you're Americans now. You serve us. We would see that as something fundamentally unjust, right? And most people would. Now, if the Canadians ask for it, if the people in the British Isles are crying to Donald Trump, please save us from this tyrannical communist government we have, that's one thing. But to roll into a country and just oppress it and turn it into a vassal state. Um,
Hmm.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but we'd all be on the same page here saying, yeah, that's bad. What is the difference between that and uh, a proper, and maybe I'm reading you wrong, but your a proper understanding of um, right of conquest? What would that mean?
This goes back to just war theory. Um, Again, this could be a whole nother episode. I'm not going to have time to go into this, but just war theory is a formulation of principle by which wars are justified, obviously. And there's several different characterizations of a just war, right? That you have to wage just war with the authority of your prince. You can't wage a just war on your own. So again, this is where I get the idea that any overthrow of the king must be led by duly constituted magistrates. You must wage war only with proper authority, the authority that God has delegated to bear the sword. It must be waged for a just cause, to punish evil in some form. And it must be waged within the right jurisdiction of the prince. You can't just, a prince's duty and jurisdiction doesn't just extend to punishing evil in whatever form it takes, wherever it happens. So typically, you don't go to war when a neighboring king might be doing something wrong to his own subjects. So you would go to war when a neighboring king is doing something wrong to your own people. That's one distinction that I think should be made.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, the right of conquest inheres in the just war making powers of the prince. So if a prince is exercising his war making power justly and is successful, and the Psalms, among many other passages of Scripture, show that God, um, what's the word I'm looking for? God expresses his approval of a king, partly by means of success. The mandate of heaven theory is a good example of this. God will give his king success in battle. So if a prince is using his just war making powers in accordance with their rightful use and is successful, his conquest is rightful.
So, how would one differentiate uh, the argument that you've just made from essentially might makes right or the ends justify the means? Obviously you've got the categories of just war theory, but most of the Christian kings throughout history who have ever gone to war have utilized reasoning or excuses of some form or another to justify their war. Um, I hold dukedom to these northern French territories, and the King of France has disrespected my dukedom, so I'm going in there as the King of England to take my sovereign reign over these English-speaking people who live there. You know that he makes the argument that this is a just war. I'm doing it to protect my people from this dictator who has overstepped his bounds. And a lot of people, especially of English extraction, would look back at that argument and say, "Ah, yes, that makes sense." But of course, he lost that war. So,
Mhm.
was he wrong, or do the ends justify the means? Does it prove, this? Was it not the mandate of heaven? Was he ultimately wrong in his claims of authority over those nations?
No, his claims of authority were rightful, but ultimately God disposes of nations.
Hmm.
So his loss in that war was God sovereignly disposing of those territories and those people to another prince.
Hmm.
So
So,
it is your opinion that losing a war doesn't necessarily mean that you were the unrighteous side
No,
of
the
that
bad
war.
guys win all the time.
okay.
I
Yeah.
mean, the American Civil War is a good example, but that's
Well,
another
that's
topic.
where, hey, that's what we were getting. Yeah. Drink to that. Woo.
Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of post-war consensuses, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
consensuses. Yeah.
Can I take a very quick break and address some things that were said in the chat? Um,
Mhm.
where was that? Oh, the Jaded Geek says, let's go ahead and pin this real quick. So I'm going to talk about it. In the United States, it is of the people, by the people, and for the people. It is our polity laid down by Christian men. I disagree. I'm going to say something about that real quick. Uh, that comes from Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. That is not something that Christian men put into our polity. But I found this through Google. Lincoln was not the first person to use a version of this phrase. In 1850, Theodore Parker, an abolitionist and Unitarian minister, but I repeat myself, had written about a government of all the people, by all the people, for all the people. But it is Lincoln's version that we remember today. So,
Mhm.
zero Christian men ever said that and inserted it into our polity.
So
Right.
That is not where that
atheists and
comes from.
Unitarians are the ones who brought
Yes.
that about in our society. So, Sean,
So,
put the disrespect on that one real quick.
yeah, because I don't respect Abraham Lincoln or abolitionists.
Fair enough.
Or Unitarians and
Or a
heretics in general.
Unitarian. Yeah, the whole shebang.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Uh, what
The,
is this?
the other thing that I would
Dickie.
like to,
Oh no, go
yeah,
ahead.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Dickie, when I was talking about the United States overrunning Canada, he says, "Why would we want it? It's just a big fridge." Yeah,
Can I
uh,
say real quick on that? The Arctic Circle is a great trade route if we can manage it from
Mhm.
a like government perspective. So if the United States owned that, it would be more valuable than the Panama Canal because of how quickly. I mean, you can just go like straight to Europe. It looks weird on like the big stretched out map, but if you look at it on a globe, I mean, it's just right there. So why would we want Canada? Trade routes
Northwest
in
Passage,
and yeah, so
the
it's a
hand
golden
of
one.
Franklin pointing o'er the Beaufort Sea. Yeah.
Strategic
Well,
considerations as well. It's
I think it has more to do with airspace, really. That
mhm.
water is never going to be very navigable unless something drastic happens. But it's airspace is where most people travel. Goods still travel mostly by ocean, but if you want to protect your airspace, you need to have forward operating bases like Alaska, like Greenland, to protect that airspace. And I think that's why. Trump is playing this game to get Greenland, because we've already got Alaska on the one side. Be nice to have Greenland on the other. So it all makes sense. But apropos of nothing, that's really unrelated to what we were talking about here. But getting back to sort of something that I started asking maybe 15 to 20 minutes ago, about the lesser magistrates. You addressed that there are certain behaviors, things that kings can do that are unrighteous to their people, right? And that, you know,
Mhm.
there is a duty of lesser magistrates to their population to um, correct such injustices. Um, but um, what precisely would you say is the role of a lesser magistrate, and when is he overstepping his bounds? When Cromwell and other Republicans or proto-Republicans stepped in and relieved the king of his own head. Were
Mhm.
they overstepping their bounds, and to what extent?
Absolutely, yes. Cromwell and the Republicans absolutely overstepped every bound of justice, both in the Civil War and in what followed. The reason is this: every man, like I said, has a duty of submission to his lawful overlord. But when the overlord commands something sinful, he has the duty to disobey the king and obey his high king, Jesus Christ, over his human king. Now, for most civil magistrates, lesser magistrates, if you will, this is going to take the form of refusing to execute a royal command upon the people. It's not going to take the form of active resistance. It will take the form of active resistance only if the king is engaging in such systemic evil conduct that it cannot be restrained and justice cannot be done except by restraining the king. Okay? If
Such as the
evil
Magna
gets
Carta.
right. The Magna Carta is a great example. John was committing such systemic injustices against all of his people across his kingdom to the point where the passive disobedience of the magistrates wasn't enough to contain it.
Hmm.
And he had to be restrained by his nobles. And they did the right thing by using the smallest force necessary to get the most effective restraint put on him. Now, contrary to popular opinion, and I was actually going to start with this uh, argument, there's more than one post war consensus that needs to be dismantled. So we need to be questioning and dismantling the post World War II consensus for sure. But we also need to dismantle things like the post World War I consensus, the post 1865 consensus, the post French Revolution consensus, and perhaps most importantly, the post English Civil War consensus, which is perhaps the first blatantly liberal uh, post war consensus in history. And each of these consensuses built upon the propagandistic foundations laid down by the former. And each of these explicitly rejected monarchy. And part of the reason is that the propaganda of the winning side formed the generally understood and accepted history of the period. So people think of Charles I as a tyrant. And when you ask them what action of Charles I was tyrannical, it's crickets. Charles
Hmm.
I was in reality one of the best rulers the English people ever had. His personal rule, when he dismissed Parliament for 11 years and ruled without them, was a heyday for the English people.
Hmm.
They enjoyed freedom from war. They enjoyed unprecedented personal liberty without interference of Parliament. They enjoyed record low taxation.
Well,
They
no
enjoyed,
taxation, if there's no parliament.
oh, they had taxes. The king
Okay.
was allowed to collect certain taxes and excises, especially tariffs on imports. But most of the king's direct taxing powers went directly to the upper class, the
Hmm.
nobles. So the average Englishman had very, very low taxes during this period. They weren't called to fight in any foreign wars. The English population boomed during this period. It was a time of peace, prosperity, and overall great government.
Hmm.
Charles, yeah, Parliament did not like that. Thank you, Dickie. Uh, they got in there and messed everything up. And the reason Charles called the Parliament back in the first place was because the people were clamoring for him to start a war to help the Calvinists on the continent of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
In that they were wanting him to intervene in the 30 Years' War. So, in order to try to get money for that, he had to call a parliament. What did Parliament try to do? They did not try to get him money for any of this. They focused on restricting his power and, by extension, arrogating it to themselves. And if you read the history of the entire period, what you see is an emerging pattern of the leaders of Parliament committing a crime, trying to make sure they didn't get punished for it by restricting the power of the king, taking as much power as they could for themselves because somebody had to have it. And if the king didn't have it, who else?
Mm-hmm.
And then using that power to commit more crimes against the king and the people, and then further restricting the king's power so he couldn't punish them for it.
Hmm.
For example, during the Bishops' Wars, the leaders of Parliament invited the Scots to invade England, not
Mm-hmm.
once but twice. And then later during the Civil War, they blamed Charles for importing foreigners from Ireland to fight against them, when he was really just importing or recalling native Englishmen on foreign service, crushing Catholic rebellion in Ireland, back home to help crush the more pressing rebellion in England. But they conveniently neglected to mention that these were not Irishmen he was calling in, they were Englishmen he was calling back.
Hmm.
But I think it's kind of ironic that after inviting foreigners to invade England themselves to fight against the king, they would use that argument as the chief argument for cutting off his head, that he imported foreigners to fight against his people.
Hmm.
It's just the when you actually study primary documents and well-written biographies of the chief men of this period, it's infuriating. Charles was his biggest mistake was not being firm enough. As he himself said, if I had denied more, I had been more obeyed.
Wow. Where do we want to go next? You want to do some objections? Not necessarily from the chat, but I had a couple of kind of bigger ones. First of all, why do you hate America? No, I'm kidding. No, but really,
Well,
you know, mud democracy. What do you say to that? Like, what's so bad about democracy?
number one, it doesn't work. The longest living democracy or direct democracy in history was Athens, and it lasted roughly 100 years uninterrupted.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay. So when I say democracy, I mean any ruling by the people, right? So like a
So
lot of people
he would
try to
include
say we're
Republican forms of government there.
yes,
Democracy or republic. Okay, I'll broaden the scope of inquiry. But democracy, I started with that partly because democracy is a totalizing ideology. And we see this march through our institutions. Our original republic was constituted with a number of safeguards against democracy because even our founders knew that democracy was unstable, it was bloody, it was inherently a bad thing. Like John Adams said, democracy doesn't last as long as monarchy, or republic, but while it lasts, it is more bloody than either. There never was a democracy that did not commit suicide. So our founders weren't proponents of democracy. In fact, they gave us several safeguards against democracy in our original Constitution. The Senate was supposed to be one. The presidency was supposed to be another. Our government was supposed to be a mixed government, which in 17th century parlance was a term of art used to denote a government which partook of the nature of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy in part. So you have parts of all three forms of government mixed to form what they termed a mixed government. The presidency was supposed to be our monarch. He was supposed to be a monarch with a defined term of office, strict limits on his authority. Although, interestingly, the president was given more real authority than monarchs of England ever used since 1708, which was the last time an English monarch used the veto over parliamentary legislation. So our president was given more real power than any monarch had used in almost a century at the time, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, he was supposed to have a defined term of office, and the method of his selection was supposed to insulate him by a double layer of insulation from any democratic principle. So instead of the state legislatures choosing him directly, like they chose the senators, the state legislatures were to choose electors, who were then supposed to use their independent judgment in selecting our president and vice president. And one of the biggest reasons for this was to prevent the president from being beholden to any faction of the people, so that the president could, when necessary, and it is often necessary, to make unpopular decisions for the good of the people. Unpopular decisions are very often necessary to ensure the survival and prosperity of a people. It just is that way. We're all grown up kids, right? You let the kids run the house, they will empty the cookie jar very quickly, and the electric bill will never be paid. So, unpopular decisions often need to be made for the good of the people. So, the president was supposed to be able to do that. He was supposed to be insulated from popular opinion to the point where he did not have to depend for his office on popularity. Well, the problem is, within 3 decades of our Constitution's ratification, we were starting to use popular election as the means of selecting the electors, because the Constitution says these electors must be chosen in such a manner as the state legislatures shall by law direct. Now, at the Constitutional Convention, it was assumed that the state legislatures would retain as much power for themselves as they could, and thus retain the power of choosing the electors directly. But what they did is they started yielding to public pressure and using a popular vote to select the electors, which resulted in the situation we have today, where in reality, the president is beholden to one faction of the American people or the other. And we see them acting like it. In all their actions, they tend to play to what is popular with their base rather than to what would be objectively for the best good of the people. So democracy has substantively, if not formally, overtaken the executive. And really, the Electoral College's days are numbered, because right now, all it really does is serve an explicitly anti-majoritarian function. And everybody is questioning the need for an institution that really only serves to deny the majority what it wants. So,
Yeah,
I think.
and so with the Electoral College in particular, I feel like it made a lot of sense back when a Texan was a Texan and a Virginian was a Virginian, and you had that kind of life. Now it's just you're an American. What state you happen to live in is where you vote. So there was and I would say that you look at Federalist number 2, where John Jay is talking about how we're all the same people racially, we're all the same, speak the same language, we have the same customs, same religion, all this. Really, the only differences was which state you were a part of, and
I think that was more relevant in the Senate than in the Electoral College.
well, I guess my point is that you can say something like, "This is what Virginians want." You can't say that anymore, because now your neighbor is from the third world, and he is representing, quote unquote, Texas just as much as I am. So,
and somebody in Pennsylvania County, Virginia, is very, very different from somebody in Loudoun County, Virginia.
yes,
Yeah.
Just
exactly.
is that way.
Yeah.
Well, and
Yeah.
even within the same counties, excluding foreigners, you still have quite strong factions. I mean,
Hmm.
as people have been pointing out this year, especially, but in the last 10 years, we can't have a country where you have some people who believe that men can be women and other
Right.
people who believe that they can't.
Hmm.
You might be, demographically of the same ethnicity or even going to the same denominational church, but having this worldview differentiation that is insurmountable. And I don't know that monarchy is going to be the solution to that. I think
I
the
think it
problems
is
there run much
because
deeper.
I think it would be too. So I want to hear
I
what you
think it
have to
would
say.
be because
Okay.
monarchy is not dependent on popularity. Monarchy does not depend on what people think at
Hmm.
any time. So if we had a monarchy, the king could simply say, no, we don't do the transgender stuff anymore. Period.
Hmm.
All legislation in favor of that wiped out, off the table, gone.
Hmm.
Instead, we penalize people for using transgender therapies and surgeries and stuff, and the people who provide those things.
Hmm.
A king can tear down the idols, cut down the groves, remove the high places. The king can do those things.
Hmm.
You can't do those things in a republic without a long and exhaustive process that in a republic that's so closely divided between two such nearly equal factions, you can't get anything done.
Well, I mean,
Because
I
right
don't know
now,
about that. Right now, they're tearing down and melting the face of Robert E. Lee. They're renaming
Mhm,
Fort Hood, and
mhm.
all of these Confederate memorials that are just being expunged from the record. And there is um, I'll say a minority, but a sizable and vocal minority that's very against it, and yet they seem to
Mhm.
be completely powerless to prevent it. So,
Right.
in that aspect, we are very much like the monarchy you're describing, where there is a group of people whose history is being erased and eradicated, and there isn't anything they can do about it.
Well, within the next 4 years, we might see a lot of these Confederate statues coming back, only to be torn down again when the pendulum swings the other way.
Hmm.
And that's the thing about monarchy. You don't have these pendulum swings all the time because public opinion is basically mob rule. And
Hmm.
mobs are very easy to sway by demagoguery and deception. Whereas a king, like I said, Donald Trump's doing his best right now. I've been watching what he's been doing, and with all the corruption being exposed, they're doing some great things. But can you imagine if Donald Trump was king right now?
it, it'd be pretty
We'd see
different.
some actual change in
Yeah.
a majorly positive direction. And not only that, it would last long enough to have a real effect on culture. You're not going to affect the culture in any major way in the direction of righteousness in 4 years. Because again, righteousness does not come naturally to people. What human nature does is it declines, it decays. All things tend towards zero entropy, and human nature is no exception.
Hmm.
So
So,
I think everyone agrees if we had a good king in place who
mhm.
just did the right thing all the time, that would be the best form of government, right?
Or
Like a
even the
perfect king,
majority of the time.
or even the yeah. So what?
51% of the time would be a heck of an improvement over what we got now.
Right. So but then people are going to say, uh, what about bad kings?
What about bad presidents?
Yeah, I mean they get voted out after 4 years, right? Like that's the. But I mean, a bad king could be going on for a
A
couple
long, long
decades,
time.
3 decades. I mean, like,
History doesn't have a lot of those, though. This is one thing where a macro study of history is very instructive. Bad kings don't tend to reign long. Let's take the kingdom of Judah in scripture for an example. If you look at the king lists in the kingdom of Judah, it's good king, bad king, good king, bad king, right? You have roughly equal numbers of good and bad kings. You got 10 good kings and 11 bad kings. But if you add up the lengths of the reigns, the good kings were reigning for almost 75% of the time.
Hmm.
5 of the bad kings ruled within the last 25 years of the kingdom alone.
Hmm.
So for almost 3 quarters of its history, Israel was reigned, or Judah was reigned by good kings. England is even more so. If you take the number of competent, generally good Christian kings, and separate them from the tyrants, the incompetents, the idiots, right? England was ruled by good kings for roughly 82% of its history.
Hmm.
Generally speaking, monarchs who are bad don't tend to reign long. God judges them. I wonder where we derive that principle from.
Well, and just to play devil's advocate here, you bring up the examples of England, the English kings, and Judah, the Jude, um,
Kingdom
the
of Judah.
Jewish king list. But what about the Israelite king list? The
Mhm.
nation of Israel, which was reigned almost exclusively by bad kings, and the worst kings did reign fewer years than the less bad kings. But overall, the kings of Israel were a bad lot, just back to back to back to back. Um,
A kingdom founded in apostasy and paganism can hardly be expected to be ruled by Christians.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So when I told some of my friends that I was going to have you on the podcast to do an interview, a fellow reached out to me under an anonymous name, but he evidently with law school to you with law went to law school with you. Sorry, it's getting late in the night. We've been going for an hour and a half, and the brain has left. But he said, he's a great guy. You're going to have a great time. He didn't send me any questions for you, but he did say, well, I disagree with his view on absolute monarchy. But what you're describing here doesn't sound a lot like an absolute monarchy. It sounds more like a republican monarchy, sort of, Magna Carta esque. And just bouncing off of that, disillusion me if I am incorrect here. But it sounds to me like you are rather in favor of a republican form of government, but with instead of an elected presidency, maybe a hereditary monarchy at the helm. Um, what would such a thing look like for the United States? If George
Mhm.
Washington had accepted the crown, and if things had gone on, if Robert E. Lee had become king of the
Robert the First.
yeah,
Yeah.
Robert the First
Oh, what might
of
have been.
America.
I know.
Yeah, it's is that something achievable in our system of government, as the founders maybe would have been sympathetic to, or would have at least tolerated? Is such a thing uh, possible in these United States of America today?
Okay. So, first of all, I'm not in favor of Republican monarchy. I'm in favor of
Okay.
what I call a conciliar absolute monarchy. And
Hmm.
this is the form of monarchy that has been pretty much ubiquitous throughout history. The king's power is theoretically absolute, but practically speaking, there are a number of real checks and balances. The power of the nobility is one. Again, like I said, you can't antagonize too many people.
Hmm.
So there's that practical check on a king's power. Where I disagree with republics is in the idea that an institutional or legal check by positive law on a king's power is a good or wholesome thing. And I say that because just as a father must have discretion within his household to take action when necessary, a king needs to have the same thing. And we see this concept in the rules surrounding emergency powers. All executives in this country have pretty much absolute power in emergencies. And even institutions like the Roman Republic had the institution of a dictator for six
Hmm.
months in emergencies. So we all recognize that absolute power needs to be exercised at certain junctures. My theory, and of course, the theory that has motivated and animated Christendom, the first Christendom that's now in serious decay, was that the king has this absolute power in general, but any king that has the wisdom to keep himself on the throne will know that you don't use all your power all the time. Only use your power when it's necessary, and be careful, because if you antagonize too many people, you know, you wind up as Charles the First, Louis the 16th. Um, historically, 35% of monarchs died violent deaths, making it the by far the most dangerous of human occupations. Historically, kings had more to fear from their peoples than the other way around.
Yeah.
So
Does that
you
does
have
that does that number include kings that died in battle?
it does, yes. So
Okay.
the number of kings that were assassinated is somewhere around, I believe, 18 to
Oh no, we lost him.
Oh no!
Oh no.
Oh man!
So
Oh, that's a bit.
the sword of Damocles,
Oh, it looks like he's back. Hold
hangs
on.
over.
Okay, can you see me
There he
again?
is. He's
All
back.
right, he's back.
Alrighty.
Let's put you over here.
Put him in the good
There we
seat.
go.
There we go.
Yeah, put him in the hot
Sorry.
seat. There we go. You were just saying 18% assassination rate. That's still quite high.
It
You
is.
know,
Yeah.
1 out of 10 would make most people fear for their life, and
Right.
that's nearly double.
So even the most theoretically absolute monarchies seldom ruled as totalitarian dictatorships.
Hmm.
The practical checks on a king's power are worth more than any institutional checks, as we see today. The institutional checks we have in our Constitution against tyranny have not prevented tyranny. So I would be in favor of an absolute monarchy with an independent council, such as the Council of Nobles, right? Like the scriptures say, by good advice make thy war. In multitude of counselors there is safety. Any wise king knows that he can't make all the decisions by himself. He needs good counsel. So that's what I'm in favor of. I'm not in favor of a republican monarchy that places institutional or positive legal checks on a king's power. The king's power is subject to reason and to the law of God, and that's it.
Would
But
you like
it's
to?
also
Oh
sorry,
no!
what?
Go on. Go on.
But it's also subject to the practical constrictions of the moment. Secondly, I think this is not only possible in our modern day, I think it's inevitable in the long run. You know, we say a lot patriarchy is inevitable, and that's right, it is. But I mean, I'm sure Sean is a military veteran. You can back me up on this. Men don't follow ideas. They don't follow principles. They follow men.
Yep.
Men follow other men. It is in the nature of humans to follow other men. And that's why Donald Trump has been so popular, especially among men. He exudes the energy of a king.
Hmm.
Donald Trump is king material. And that's why men follow him. You
Yep.
know, Kamala Harris's vote, if you look at the proportions of the male vote Donald Trump got versus the female vote Kamala Harris got, it's women following Harris and men following Trump. Men follow men. And if patriarchy is inevitable, so is monarchy, because monarchy is patriarchy applied to the state.
Hmm.
Therefore, at some point, we're going back to a monarchy. I don't know when, but it's going to happen. So even
Yeah, well,
in our modern day, it could.
even people who are not strictly speaking monarchists, people who don't endorse the idea, still
Mhm.
see. You still have people writing about the cycle of nations. They start out as some form of tribalistic group, and then they kind of
Mhm.
turn into a bureaucracy. Maybe they go Republican, then they start out Republican and they go kind of Democratic, and then democracy runs its course and people get fed up with it, and you end up with a Caesar or a Napoleon.
Mhm.
And people in making this observation were not strictly speaking endorsing the concept. They were just saying that that's what tends to happen. That's what you see when the nation has run its course. Eventually you have a Caesar rise up, seize control of the state's apparatus, and wield it to his own ends.
Mhm. Right, or to the people's ends, whichever, which oftentimes are not very distinguishable. That's why he
Yeah,
gets to where he is in the first place.
often not
But
mutually exclusive.
right, right. So conceivably, we could crown Donald Trump,
Hmm.
start a Trump dynasty.
I'm down for it. Barron
Now,
seems like he's got the mojo. So
yep, I'll leave that right there. But he even looks like Augustus. But anyway,
oh yeah,
He does.
the
yeah.
one nice thing about monarchy is that a king has to keep his government small enough to keep track of.
Hmm.
because the king bears ultimate responsibility for everything his government does. Because the person with all the power is the person with all the responsibility. So he bears responsibility before his people for everything his government does. So if he lets his government get away from him, he's on the hook for it. So if we crowned a king in this country, our government would shrink by a lot just by sheer necessity. How many government workers do you think there are? It's just civilian government employees, not counting any part of the military or law enforcement establishment.
Got to be a
Between
million.
350,000.
between 21 and 26 million,
No
Whoa.
depending on
way.
the year. Yep.
Wow.
At all
What?
levels of government, including state and federal.
That
And
is a. What is the percentage of?
That's about 7% of the US population.
yeah, I mean, the
That's
U.S. population is
insane.
only 330 million. So,
No king on earth could keep track of that.
No.
And the
hmm,
reason we have that is because there is nobody in our government who bears ultimate responsibility for it. Who has ultimate responsibility for what our government does? The
nobody.
president can hide behind Congress. Congress can blame the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can say, well, we can't usurp the
We
functions
don't
of the
write
political
laws.
branches.
Yeah. Hmm.
Mhm. So nobody bears responsibility for anything, but everybody has some power. So let's get this straight. We give people power without responsibility and then are surprised when this results in the irresponsible use of power.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh,
How can it result in anything else?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I mean,
I
this is a
from a
discussion that I've had with some friends of mine at church when we were, before the election, before November. We were discussing the viability, the allowability of a Christian to vote for Donald Trump, and they're bringing in, the standards for what a righteous king should be, laid out in the Old Testament, and also bringing in some New Testament standards for what a patriarch in the church should be. What are the qualifications for an elder, and then saying blatantly to the people around them, well, Trump is none of these things. He's not the husband of one wife. He doesn't follow the Old Testament law. He doesn't believe in the scriptures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And my argument at the time, and I would still make this argument today, was that in a democracy, you know, the responsibility of a voter is actually much more diffused than the responsibility of a king,
Mhm.
because the duty of a king, when when Moses was selecting his judges, he had these criteria of men who were followers of God, who had certain and I forget what the criteria were at this point, but certain criteria for what a ruler should be. And
Mhm.
I said, well, my criteria for what I vote for is actually much more diffused than that, because I am having to realpolitik this thing. I'm having to say what is achievable, what is realistic, but also not all, not only that, but also at the end of the day, um, my responsibility is so diffused because of competition that I bear much less responsibility for the thing. And it's also true at the elected level. People who are in government have much less responsibility for what they're doing. For the example that you just gave, they can hide behind other people who are opposing them. But also, at the end of the day, it is in fact true that the Senate is only responsible for what the Senate can do. The Supreme Court is only responsible for what the Supreme Court can achieve. And now it looks like we lost Sean, so hopefully he'll hop back in here. But
The
you know,
responsibility that anybody has in our system is almost purely theoretical. Nobody has any actual responsibility for any actual action.
yeah. Well, that is a puzzling, sort of a puzzling situation to get past. It might have been last week, or it might have been the week before, where I played a short clip of Hans Hermann Hoppe, who is a German intellectual. He's a libertarian.
Mhm.
He famously wrote the book Democracy, the God That Failed. But in
Mhm.
his book, he actually makes not an argument for democracy per se, but for democracy being better than the situation that we're in now, which I think anyone, this book was written maybe 12 or so years ago at this point. Um,
We're
but
basically in a democracy now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as you mentioned earlier in the program, the president was supposed to be elected by electors who are appointed by the states. He was not supposed to be democratically uh, elected, at
Hmm.
least not directly.
Same with the
Senators
Senate.
from the states were supposed to be appointed by their state senates, or at least their state legislatures. I forget the exact
Hmm.
verbiage
Yep,
of
state
that.
legislators.
But the checks and balances though that we see in that republic, it's like that cycle that I talked about, that several thinkers in history have pointed out, that there is this cycle where things that start out as a republic with balances of power uh, devolve into democracies, direct democracies with not much balance of power. There's no inherent responsibility, and eventually the people do get fed up with it, and eventually you do end up with something like a monarchy, or something like a Caesar or a Napoleon, or a Baron Trump coming along and being like, you know what, we're going to doge our way out of this. We're going to just crush everything down until we've got total control in the head of
Hmm.
state.
I have
Another thing,
a whole chapter on this in my book.
yeah. Well, we're definitely looking forward to the release of this book. You're in talks with publishers now, I understand. And do you, before we wrap this up, just want to say, do we have a timeline for the release of this book? What is the status of it? Have you finished writing it? Is it in proofreading now? What's the status of that?
It's completed. It's through proofreading. It's currently under review with a publisher, one that we all know and love. I'm not going to divulge who it is, but
Hmm.
um, once they get through their review of it, I'm hoping we can get it released by
What a
the beginning of
cliffhanger!
June.
Hello, hello. Say again.
Oh
Say
no.
again.
I'm
You're hoping
hoping
we
we
can
can get it released by the beginning of June or so.
by the
Ooh,
beginning of June. Okay, well that's
nice.
Hopefully.
that's pretty soon. That's pretty quick here.
Cool.
Coming up quickly. All right. Well, we've been going on for almost 2 hours now. We should probably wrap it up. Did you have any closing thoughts, Samuel, before we scroll through the chat and look around for any comments that we might want to talk about?
God save the king, whoever that is, and reveal him
Whoever
soon.
he may be. Oh, that did remind me of one question that I didn't ask, which is, what is the role of the people? You've mentioned several times. Um, Monarchy does not depend on the will of the people. The
Mhm.
guys who just want to grill, they don't have to follow the politics of the thing, because at the end of the day, their opinion doesn't really matter. But when it comes to establishing a democracy, or a monarchy, I mean, oftentimes you do see the people. We see this in the Old Testament. The people chose Saul. God ultimately is the one who chose Saul, but the people elect a king. The people rally around a king and put him in his place. Um, is that legitimate? And how? What is the role of the hoi polloi in this entire system?
Mhm. I'm not going to rule out the fact or the idea that people can elect a king in the first instance. I do deny that that happened in Scripture, though.
Mm,
Um, in the cases of Saul and David and Solomon, the people never exercised any power of election. God directly chose their king, revealed him to them, and they tendered their submission.
hmm,
It's when they say the people made Saul king. Um, the Scripture does say the people made him king.
hmm,
They made him king in the same sense the people of England made Charles the first or the third king
Mm,
a couple years ago.
hmm.
Legally speaking, he was king the moment his mother died.
Right.
When the people made him king, they crowned him king. It was a solemnization of the covenant between the ruler and the ruled. It
Hmm.
wasn't an election. We don't see any election of kings in Scripture other than kings like Abimelech, king of Shechem. The only elections we ever see in Scripture were unqualified disasters.
Hmm.
So God never blesses an elected king in Scripture. I'm not going to rule out the idea that he could do so today.
Hmm.
He could possibly use the election of the people as a means to choose the first king in a dynasty.
Yeah.
More typically, I think we'll see God's king expressed or revealed by success either in electoral politics or war. I think the success Donald Trump has been having might be the type of thing we might be looking for. Um, of course, popularity is going to be a big part of this, right?
Hmm.
Because the first king in a dynasty is going to need to have the charisma necessary to unite the nation. So the people will have some role in it. I'm not going to prescribe what role that's going to be because it's going to be so factually dependent, which is one of the things about monarchy that's different than other democracies. It's not ideological, it's practical. So you have a very fact dependent set of rules governing it. It's not something where you plan for the future that you don't know about yet and start writing rules for possible contingencies that may or may not occur. Rather, you just say, this is what we're doing. The king can make decisions as he goes along, as justified by circumstance. And it's the same with the institution of the king. It's going to take some form. We don't know what that is yet. Um, but yeah, the people could elect a king. The people could crown a king that has, delivered the people from an invasion, for instance.
Hmm.
And y-
Hmm.
well,
Hmm.
Hmm.
I think
Hmm.
I'll just stop there.
Uh,
Things
I,
that
I
make you go, hmm.
I wanted to
Hmm.
make just a couple quick things before we go to questions. First of all, I'm looking very much forward to this book. And one positive of monarchy that me and Jeff talked about in the past is the quality of the rulers that come out of it, because you have this situation where a a son is born and immediately he is learning how to be king by the other king,
Hmm.
by the guy he's taken over for,
Hmm.
Yeah.
who is his father. And I mean, it's just so much better than, hey y'all, I grew up from nothing. I'm just like you, and I put on a
My
fake
dad was a
accent.
mailman.
Yeah, and
And
Hmm.
I'm good
and
at telling you what you want to hear.
Hmm.
yeah, and I can convince 51% of the people to put my name on a ballot and
Hmm.
that kind of thing. So
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
that is one thing that I feel that is the strongest argument, is that you are raising up a young boy from the very earliest ages to be the king. And like you said, the percentage wise, it works out more often than not.
Hmm.
So
Have we been ruled by good presidents for 82% of our history?
no, no.
How about just in the last century?
I would be
Good
curious.
presidents in the last
I would
century.
I would be curious to see if there were 82% good presidents pre Civil War. I think that would be, because I would make the argument that we
Hmm.
established a completely new system of government and a completely new nation came out of that war. So I
Hence
don't.
why the post 1865 consensus, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah. It's
Yep.
mhm.
frustrating.
Birth of
Yep.
a nation, so to speak.
Heyo. So I when I dropped, I lost all of the comments
Oh,
in
did you
in
know?
the chat. Yeah.
Let actually let me oh, well, you're still a moderator, but all right. Well, I'll go ahead and start at the top. Um, and we'll go through these one at a time. Some of these we already touched
Yes.
briefly, some of these we did not. Jaded Geek says the Magdeburg Confession has much good to say in delineation of the role of the lesser magistrate. It helped my former LCMS church stay open during COVID. Highly recommend. So the Magdeburg Confession. I'm not a Lutheran. I don't know much about that, but Sean, thoughts on that?
Uh, I mean, it's good stuff
Hmm.
as far as I
Just
can see. I mean, I
do the
don't know
reading.
the. Yeah, I mean, it's not a confession that is part of the Book of Concord,
Hmm.
which is this tome back here, this fat one.
Yeah.
Um, but it did come out of Lutheranism, so many people, you can choose to subscribe to it or not.
Hmm.
I don't really
Yeah,
have
and
much
that
more to say than that.
he talks about it helping my former LCMS church. Interesting to point out, the LCMS does not hold to the Magdeburg Confession in any official way, but
Right.
it is still guided by the principles therein, I would say, in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
LCMS, of course, for those who are not familiar, the Lutheran or the
Lutheran
Lutheran
Church
Church,
Missouri Synod.
Lutheran
Missouri
Church
Synod.
Missouri Synod, which is the largest. If I'm not mistaken, Sean, correct me if I say something wrong, but it's the largest Lutheran denomination in the United States, and it is far and away the most conservative as well. Well, of the
I
major
don't know.
denominations.
I don't. I
Um,
would say it is one of the more conservative denominations. That's a
mhm.
whole other
Yeah, I
thing.
mean,
But
you get into some micro denominations here and
yeah,
there, which are just like to the right of Attila the Hun, but
but I don't. I
no
don't.
real, no
Yeah,
real political,
I
no
don't
real political
actually.
power in those groups.
I don't actually know how big the ELCA is compared to the LCMS, but they are the ELCA is an apostate
Hmm.
denomination. There's nothing redeemable.
Yeah,
So as far as
a
like
lot like the
actual,
PCUSA. Yeah.
yeah. One thing that I was going to say about Magdeburg, um, from what I remember, it's been a while since I've read it, but the argument isn't the it's not our king is not doing well, therefore we're establishing democracy. It's our king is not doing right, we're going to overthrow him and put in a new king, which I
Hmm.
believe would be in accordance with what you're saying. Correct me if I'm wrong, because if you're
Mhm.
familiar with this, go ahead and give us your thoughts on it.
I read it a long time ago, but yeah, it is pretty good. Um, it's also fairly constrictive of the circumstances in which a king could be deposed. You can depose a king on the basis of it, but typically you would replace him by the next legitimate heir to the
Hmm.
throne. You'd replace a bad king with another king who would hopefully learn the lesson and be a good king. Um, because really the answer to a bad king is not a democracy. It's not
Yeah.
replacing hierarchy with equality. The answer to a good king in the or to a bad king in the end is a good king.
Yeah. So a corollary for that would be, the replacement for a bad dad is not CPS putting you into,
Yeah.
a
Hmm.
rotating living with
Yeah.
different people until eventually you grow up, turn 18, and you're out of the system. The
Or the
solution
kids
would be,
just deciding everything by vote and not having a
Mhm.
dad.
Yeah, the solution for that would be to physically remove, so to speak, the bad dad and replace him with a relative who can function as a dad to that child.
Hmm.
So Washington should have taken the crown when it was offered to him. Is what
Yes, he
we're.
should have.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There you go.
yeah.
Boom.
Yep. King Washington, King George the Fourth.
Could have done worse. Could have done worse. This we already touched on before. Perhaps we are the means to end the period of judgment by overthrowing that wicked king. Um, you know, uh, Getting back to the Magdeburg Confession, there, what is the role of the people in overthrowing an evil king?
Well, again, it's been a long time since I read the Magdeburg Confession,
Hmm.
so I'm not really qualified
Well,
at
if we
this
just
point.
go with the theory of the lesser, doctrine of the lesser magistrates,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
it's
The
it's the role of men who are already leaders in their communities to do such a thing. You don't
mhm,
just want Billy Bob with his buddies to show up with 30
with
six,
rifles.
uh, you know, bolt action rifles and overthrow the presidency and establish a new guy. You want somebody that's got a little bit of cachet. Um,
Mhm.
you know, this is just speaking from practical. If you have um, Billy Bob and his buddies show up, that's not necessarily going to be a long lasting solution.
Well, part of our individual duty of submission to the magistrates is that we owe each magistrate a duty to help him establish justice. So if he requires our assistance in restraining a magistrate or a king who is above him, we owe him a duty to follow him and help him in the interest of justice, as long as it's true justice. Because if the lesser magistrate who's asking for our assistance is just rebelling, we owe a duty to not follow him in that case.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting thing that sometimes the most loving thing is to not give somebody what they want.
Precisely.
So Yeah, the right thing to do with an unrighteous king is actually to not obey him. Quite an
Hmm.
interesting thought there. Uh, uh, in that vein, quick thoughts on the Magna Carta. You said you kind of liked it before.
Hmm.
Doesn't that though cut against this sort of idea of absolute monarchy that you expressed before?
No, not really. The Magna Carta is a charter granted by the king, not a constitution imposed on him. So it's an agreement granted by the king's own free will, and it has no binding authority on the next king unless the next king confirms it.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. Well, and I'm just showing my lack of historical understanding there because I did not realize that it was had, as it were, a time limit on it in that way.
Yeah, it's like any other charter. Kings can grant charters all the time. You grant a charter, and then that charter remains the law for as long as you are king or until you revoke it.
Hmm. 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 Interesting. Interesting. All right. Jaded Geek again. He says regarding the role of necessity of lesser magistrates in acting against a lawful overlord. What are your thoughts on the Battle of Athens, Tennessee? Are you familiar with this?
I think so. Is that the one where the
Um,
veterans came in
yeah,
and?
I believe this is post World War II. United States
Mhm,
vets came in and uh, forced an election. Of course, history is written by the winners. So,
Yeah.
mhm.
um,
It
uh,
was,
whatever kind
rampant
of
corruption and
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
but alleged rampant corruption in a democratic system. They seized control of the voting locations and held, you know, you know, processed the election to their own um, understanding of justice, and
Mhm.
ended up electing the guy that they wanted, as opposed to the sheriff that they had, who was, squandering and pilfering, et cetera, et cetera.
See,
I'm
this is
not
one of the problems with. Sorry,
Yeah, I'm not
go ahead.
familiar enough with the legend to say that for sure they were in the right, but I definitely like the sound of World War II vets coming home with military grade weaponry and overthrowing a small local government because they found it to be completely corrupt. It fits very nicely with my American sensibilities.
To some extent, this is one of the disadvantages of a democratic system. There is no lawful overlord in a
Hmm,
democratic system because a system that's based on voting has the bottom of the hierarchy at the top. There
hmm,
is no vote based system that is hierarchical. So the doctrine of the lesser magistrates and all that doesn't really apply to a democracy. Instead, it's basically just a free for all. In a democracy, whoever, as long as the people agree that they'll solve their disputes by voting, voting works. When they quit agreeing to that, it's whoever has superior force.
hmm.
And on that note, uh, what happened at the Battle of Athens should have happened in 2020 when they boarded up the windows so that people couldn't see them pulling fake ballots. And
Hmm.
but hey, that's
Well, if
against
we
the law,
abolish
so
the
you can't
vote,
do that, right? Yeah,
that's not a problem.
yeah, exactly. And on that note, I would want to follow a strong group of men who take up arms to do what's right, and I think most men would
Hmm.
follow that kind of courage and take over. And I think
Hmm.
that is another plus for monarchy. So
Hmm.
Well, and I think you have this very strange situation in a democracy where, if, Lex Rex, if the law is the king, then of course overthrowing an elected official is breaking the law, and de facto you are overthrowing the king by disobeying the law. So by that reasoning, you are overthrowing the king. That is a form of pretended, as it were, regicide. So people are loath to do such a thing because the consequences are so extreme. You're overthrowing our democracy. January 6th was a threat to our democracy. So
Oh,
just
that it were.
yeah, just
yeah,
by merely showing up and if January 6th had happened with M16s instead of grannies toting water bottles, um,
Yeah.
you would never hear. I mean, still, you're never going to hear the end of it, but you're never going to hear the end of such a thing, because you're breaking the rule of law, so to speak. So
which is a
um,
total legal fiction anyway.
yeah, a very interesting tenuous position. But the the thing I wanted to point out is it takes the wind out of the sails of anyone who's actually trying to fix the system. You
Hmm.
can vote your way into a bad situation, but you can't vote your way out of it. But in a Lex Rex situation, you can't do anything else to get out of it either, except by
Hmm.
abolishing the very notion of Lex Rex itself.
Right.
Yeah. The we're talking about the rule of law. You're saying that, in your words, you said it was a legal fiction,
Hmm.
and I think that,
Law can't rule. Only
right,
men can.
Hmm.
right.
Yeah,
It reminds me
the
of something my
Constitution is only as powerful as the people who are enforcing it.
well,
Hmm.
like my father-in-law. I put this really dinky lock on my tool shed, and he was like, it's there to keep honest men honest,
Hmm.
right? Like that's what he was saying. But like when it comes to the rule of law, we have founding fathers talking about our nation not being fit, uh, for anything other than a moral and religious people. Well, if you have a moral and religious people, then you don't need these laws or anyone to enforce them or anything like
Yeah.
that. So for your system to need this perfect population for it to even work, I mean that means the system doesn't work.
Hmm.
And
Is based on an overly optimistic estimation of human nature.
yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Which is uh, the inherent problem of liberalism in general. Yeah.
Hmm.
Parliament engaging in liberal projection against the king. LOL from Jade Geek. Yeah. Um, I am not the history buff on the Glorious Revolution and its fallout and such
You mean
things.
the English Civil War, right?
Yeah. The
The
the English
Glorious
Civil
Revolution
War.
was over 100 years later.
Well,
Oh
I am
no, he
I am
did it
t- I
again.
am showing my ignorance here. I am not a scholar of English history at all. I have a high school understanding of the thing at best, and high school is increasingly far and far away. So yeah, the Parliament. History is written by the victors. The Parliament overthrew the king, and they got to write the history books. Sometime later, some people came back and exhumed bodies and hung them and put heads on pikes that eventually fell off in windstorms and such things. But
Hmm.
what's your overall take on you know the posthumous exhuming of Cromwell and trying? Is that to you full
Petty but
throatedly
glorious.
endorsed? Petty but glorious. Petty indeed. Petty. I'll have to agree that it's petty, but sometimes petty behavior is to be encouraged. I
Hmm.
can be petty at times.
Symbolic.
Trump is being petty right now, and I'm rather enjoying it.
Pettiness is often symbolic, and monarchical leadership, like leadership in general, often relies on symbolism to be effective.
Hmm. Hmm. And Dicky over on YouTube says, "Don't forget the statues, meaning the Confederate statues that are being torn down, weren't from immediately after the war. You're not all wrong." I'm not sure what he means by "I'm not all wrong," but he's probably referring to my historical illiteracy.
I think
But
what he was saying was it was in the context of the ebb and flow of, like, oh, we really like Confederates, and then we
hmm
really don't like
hmm
them. And so he was saying, like, it wasn't just this immediate group of people right after the war who built all the statues. They
yeah,
built them 100 years after, which is the reason why people will always say, like, oh, well, these statues, most of them were built during the civil rights era. Well, yeah, that was the 100th anniversary of the war.
hmm
All these events in the 60s were the 100th anniversary. So for a whole, like, 4 years, 5 years, you were having anniversary after anniversary at the
Hmm.
centennial. So yeah, they put up a bunch of statues during that time.
yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
also it's an important thing to note. These military bases that were named after Confederate generals, almost exclusively in the South. I might be mistaken, but I think exclusively within the South. It was also at the same time as this rapid militarization, I believe, in the build up to either World War I or World War II.
World War
Um,
One.
so not the statues necessarily, but the military bases being named, and it was sort of a placation move. The South is being militarized by a big Yankee force. They're seizing huge tracts of land, and here's, as it were,
A
a
bone.
yeah, here we're going to throw you a bone. Yeah, we're going to seize a bunch of your assets. Yeah, we're going to militarize your nice, little farm community. Where I live, not far from Fort Hood. You have, and I will not call it by that new name. It is Fort Hood. Um, you know, Farm communities. There's nothing around here but farms. We were not an industrial powerhouse at the time. We're still not. We have like one aluminum parts factory north of here on I-35 a little bit. It's like we're farm communities for the most part. Um, but when you have this military force that's occupying the place, they want to ingratiate themselves to the locals, and this was a very easy way of doing it. They're like, hey, here's the name of a Confederate general who's kind of from the area, very well esteemed. General Hood, to this day considered the very best instructor that the military academy in New York. What is that one called, Sean? I'm bad with names,
In New
but
York?
yeah, isn't it in New York
West
State?
Point.
West Point, yeah. Is that
Oh,
not in New York?
I think you're thinking of Robert E. Lee. I don't think.
No, Hood is considered, at least I have been told, that Hood is considered to be one of the best instructors that West Point ever did have.
I've never heard that. You might be
Yeah,
right. I don't know.
I might be right.
Hmm.
This might be another 100 Years War,
Yeah. Wow.
where I'm attributing things to the wrong
I
thing.
know that Robert E. Lee is famous for not having had a single demerit during his
Mhm.
time at West Point. He is
Mhm.
sometimes wrongly said to be the only person in that history, but there was actually another person in his class who didn't have another demerit. But I believe it was really only those like 2 or 3 guys. So I mean, it was extremely rare.
Yeah,
It's still
wasn't he present for the Eggnog War, but was not actually involved with it? Like he was kind of part of
I think
putting
that's
oil on the water and smoothing it all over.
I think that's Jefferson Davis.
Oh, that well, I
Mhm.
no,
I believe
Jefferson Davis was involved with the war,
uh,
wasn't he? I think he was one of the
the
participants, if I'm not mistaken.
uh,
But I did
I
not go
know
to West
Jefferson
Point. I was
Davis has
thinking,
history with
yeah.
that eggnog
Well, and
war. I
the
know that.
Eggnog
I
War
don't know.
had it was a who's who of the Civil War, which is part of the reason I think it's so well remembered
Yeah.
by people today. Is just because you can see this is what they were like when they were all teenagers, and then some time later they're all trying to kill each other. But
After
very
they went
interesting.
and beat the Mexicans,
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
then
Yeah,
they
there's a
fought each
question
other.
rolling around on Twitter. What it might have been today, it might have been yesterday, where somebody was saying, what was the last war that the United States engaged in that you think was a just war? And uh, there was one fellow, Bendel Wary, good dude. Give him a follow if you're on Twitter. He's a barrel of laughs, and he's also quite intelligent. A fun combination of things. And he said, the Civil War, but he called it the War of Northern Aggression, as all good men should. And he was saying, the South funded that war out of her own pockets, and that was the last legitimate war. But for me, I have to lay that one aside because the federal government took the wrong side on that one. For me, that would be the Mexican-American War was the last legitimate war that the United States was in that I think was legitimate. There was a two nations becoming one, and a separate nation tried to involve herself in a way in which she was not welcome, and she was quickly kicked to the corner where she belongs, and has never, I am never going to financially recover from this. Yeah,
Yeah.
never has returned to her former glory of actually being um, a country that people actually worried about having an army. Nobody's shaking in their boots if Mexico says, if you don't ship up, we're going to declare war on you. Nobody in their right mind is scared of that. Um, you know, Botswana would be able to handle such a thing.
Uh, on YouTube, is it Dickies or Dickie S?
Dickie S. Yeah.
Is saying that they were definitely both there. I believe he's saying that Robert E. Lee was there at that
hmm
eggnog war. So
Yeah. Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, I remember uh, in the little bit of study that I did do on it a long time ago, Robert E. Lee was part of. He was being studious while the other kids were being festus, or festival.
Festive.
Festive. That's the word. Golly, 10 o'clock at night. My brain is gone. But he said he was part of you know, as it were, a delegation between the students and the administration to kind of keep things from kind of resolve the issue, if I'm not mistaken. Stonewall Jack Style on Rumble says, "King Trump, I'm here for it." You know what? We could do much worse.
Let's
Um,
do it.
then Jaded Geek, following his line of thought from earlier, he says, "Yeah, the Lutheran Church went with Melanchthon instead of von Amsdorf, who wrote the Magdeburg Confession." Yeah, I mean, Melanchthon's great, but he was no Luther. He certainly went a lot closer to Rome than von Amsdorf did. So I am not the Lutheran scholar on this as well. So
I am
Sean,
also not a scholar. People will try to defer to me because I am Lutheran, but that does not mean I have all of German history down
yeah.
and all that kind of stuff.
All right. Well, I'm going to pop over to Twitter real quick, see if anybody's got any questions in there for you, Samuel. No takers on the Twitter side. So we
Do
have been
we
going.
do we
What's
each
that?
want to just like give a final sign off kind of thing?
Yeah. Samuel, you give us for people who are interested in your book, we don't have a publisher who's said, yeah, we're going to take it just yet. We've got some people who probably are going to release it. We're happy to see that. But in the meantime, where can people find you? Are you on Twitter? Are you on YouTube? Do you have a podcast? What does that look like for you?
I'm basically very low profile on social
Mm-hmm.
medias. I am on Twitter. You tag me in your post. My handle is at SamuelJohn3089.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also on Facebook. You can find me there, just Samuel Johnson.
All right.
Um, but yeah, I keep a very low profile on social media for the present. I don't have any podcasts or anything like that.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we look forward to hearing from you again at the release of the book. If the book gets released and it gets a big, resounding, either good or bad people talking about it, we'd love to have you back on the podcast. Don't forget about us when you become famous. It started right here, folks.
Yeah,
The
there you
infamous
go.
Samuel, who is going to overthrow our government and establish the new
Yeah.
monarchy. He
I
started
will
out
never
right here.
overthrow the government, and I will
I,
not establish a
I
new
do
monarchy.
I do want to say
In
on that
Minecraft.
yeah. I do want to say on that note that I know a lot of people are going to listen to this and hear us saying positive things about monarchy
Hmm.
and even advocating for it at times. And,
Mhm.
and if you understand that America is a people and not just this idea,
Hmm.
then you can you can see that America could be a monarchy, and it would just be a better system for the people.
Hmm.
And
It would.
you wouldn't lose America because America is not an idea; it is a people. So that is
Mhm.
my
Yeah.
closing thought on that for people who come after me, being a
Yeah.
veteran of a foreign war and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I
Uh,
do. I'm very loyal to America, so don't think that I'm not.
Feds don't come get me just
Yeah,
yet. Uh,
yeah.
Not until I've actually January 6th something. Uh,
If I may, I would say it's not our place to overthrow the government by force. We are to pray for our rulers. We are to advocate peacefully for policies that we think would be better. And if that includes advocating to those who are in authority over us right now, such as President Trump, advocating for him to pick up the crown that's currently lying in the gutter, so be it. But I do not advocate overthrowing the government by force. I will never countenance such a thing.
all right.
All
Well,
right.
the stream cut out for just a second while you were saying that. Hopefully, on
No,
the
I heard it.
playback, it'll still be there. But
It
that
was
might have
there.
been my internet connection dropping.
You cut out. He was still there.
Yeah. Well, to sign off, I will say, Samuel Johnson, it has been an absolute joy to have you, and almost thou convincest me to become a monarchist. So,
I would that thou wert both almost and altogether such as I am,
Yeah.
except for these democratic bonds.
All right.
This
Well,
is
folks,
definitely our best episode yet. So please
uh,
come on the show again if we've got something else to talk
absolutely, yeah.
about. So,
And we should do this more often, Sean, where we get smart people to talk to it. It
yeah.
makes our show that much more entertaining.
Yes.
Well,
Amen.
to the folks who are still watching, thank you for coming along. We appreciate you being here for as long as you were. This has gone a bit long. It's been a 2.5 hour show, and hopefully, this has given some people some things to think about. And this is a conversation that's been going on for centuries at this point. This started in this. Well, I mean, our current iteration started in the 1600s, but this has really been something going on since Samuel's time. The debates about monarchy and the merits or demerits thereof. So thank you for coming along. Hope this has been an excellent avenue for thoughts along these lines. Have a wonderful night, and we will catch you all on the next one. Everyone, take care.